Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Everyman's Odyssey podcast, where we explore the challenges and values of authentic living through sharing stories and ideas. I'm your host, Cole McClure. And in the spirit of sharing stories and ideas, this week's episode is just about me. For better or worse, you were warned already. We're going to take some time, and I just want to share a little bit about my life, where I've come from, some of the things that I've gone through, and some things that have shaped me and built me into who I am today. And you'll see I've got some notes here because even when it comes to my own life, especially early childhood, my memory can be a bit rough sometimes. So you'll have to forgive me while I go over some of my notes. But I do want to take some time and share a little bit about me. So I hope that's something you're interested in. So we'll go ahead and just get started. So first of all, why would I choose to do this? It's actually something I'm pretty uncomfortable doing. Believe it or not, I know that's weird thinking about, how much time I spend in front of this camera to begin with. But I was trying to think of some things that I wanted to cover in the next topic. And so I'm brainstorming different ideas. And my wife, Nicole, had actually brought up the idea of, maybe you need to take some more time and tell people about yourself. And I thought, why on earth would I want to do that? But she is a very wise woman who I love dearly. And she pointed out that if I'm wanting to start, a movement and a community of people who are there for each other and motivate each other and connect with each other, how am I going to do that if I'm not willing to be vulnerable and share who I am and where I've come from? Who's going to listen to somebody that they don't really know? So she made a pretty good point there. So I decided to go ahead and move forward with that. So it seems silly to me, but I'm just going to start at the beginning. I was born in 1988. In a small town in Northern California. We've got a population of, roughly 13,000 people. Not a whole lot going on here, but my childhood was fantastic. I mean, when you think about the quintessential, maybe even idyllic childhood for a kid growing up in the 90s, that's what it was. I had a loving home. I, had dirt bikes and Disneyland trips and camping trips and a best friend that I did everything with. And so everything went pretty smoothly. My life was fantastic and easy. And like I said, filled with love and adventure and happiness. And so growing up, I was a very happy kid, but also kind of unsure of myself and very fearful of the unknown, fearful of failure and not knowing how to do things. An early childhood memory that sticks out is, when I was 8, I got this awesome little Pee-wee dirt bike and I was riding it around. My dad took me out to a track to learn how to ride, and I would just ride in straight lines. I would go to the end of the track and I would stop, get off my bike, turn around and ride it back. And I was too scared to turn. I didn't know how. I had never done it before, and I was afraid I was going to fall or mess up. And so after watching me just ride in these straight lines back and forth for a while, my dad finally comes up to me and tells me, why aren't you turning? Just turn your bike so you can do the whole track. I told him I'm too scared. I don't know how. I'm going to fall over. And after crying and complaining about being scared of falling over for so long, I remember he finally just comes up to the dirt bike, kicks the side of it while I'm on it, and knocks me over. And I cried for a second, but it's, okay, you fell over. How bad was that? Oh, well, that wasn't so bad, I guess. I was right. Okay, turn the bike. If you fall over, you'll fall over. I mean, it's a little bike and I'm a little kid. It's not that far to fall. So that was my first realization, of sometimes your fear getting the best of you when there's really not that much to be afraid of. You You just got to act. And so that always sticks out in my mind when I'm scared of trying new things, or scared of failing. I just think about my dad kicking my dirt bike over and letting me experience that worst case scenario to realize that it's okay. Even if you fall, it is okay. And so I've always dealt with that fear, I think, but that always sticks out as something that has carried me through to remind me of how you deal with fear. So I was also raised going to church, and I remember my Sunday school experiences pretty vividly a lot of times. I actually still remember going to one of the, I don't know if you guys are familiar, but with like the Christian, like strongman demonstrations and shows that were pretty popular in the 90s. I went there with my grandma, and that is when I had officially decided to like give my heart to Jesus. I couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. I was very young. But I still remember that feeling of excitement, walking up to the front and learning about what that commitment meant. I remember my Sunday school teacher being there, and she's the one who gave me that little bracelet of the colored beads that helps you understand what your relationship with God means and what that can look like. And then I remember going out to ice cream with my grandma afterwards to celebrate. But I also remember lying in bed for quite a few nights after that. And I just couldn't sleep at night, and I would be crying in my bunk bed with my Aladdin blankets, talking or just crying about feeling like it's not enough. And I just couldn't understand how the idea of grace and salvation, now knowing the things that Jesus did and went through, how could that just be a gift? How is there not something required of me, to just feel okay with accepting this? And I struggled with that guilt as a little kid for a long time, just lying awake at night thinking like, what am I supposed to do to earn this? And never really grasping at that age, there's nothing to do to earn it. It was just a gift given out of love. And I suppose that guilt and that fear and that feeling of, requirement for my own sacrifice is something that I've come to understand and somewhat control and deal with. But even to this day, I don't know that that's something that I could say that I've conquered. There's still a lot of areas of my life where I feel like I have guilt or survivor's guilt, or feel compelled to be earning things when there's things that are just freely given. So that is a part of my life that sticks out, that I honestly don't really think about that often anymore, but it is a part of who I am. Another big part of my early childhood was this fascination with the military and aviation, specifically within the military, and having a strong desire to be in the Army. I'm not really sure what it was that was the catalyst for that, but I did love the idea of, being the good guy and traveling the world and growing up very patriotic and being in a small town that is not uncommon. But I remember growing up with these 2 big binders. One binder was full of little pamphlets about animals and all the information about them because I loved nature and wildlife. And then the other binder was pamphlets about military aircraft and every jet that was in the military's arsenal and old ones and helicopters. And so I always had this fascination with being in the military. And my best friend and I, growing up together, we had known each other since we were 4 years old. We had always said that we would join the Army together someday. And we'll get into that later on in the story. But, I guess foreshadowing a little bit, I've always had this strong desire to serve in the Army. And so looking back, I am incredibly grateful for how blessed I was to have, such good parents who loved me so well, and a dad that worked so hard and did everything he possibly could to provide a good, stable life for his family. And when he was home, he was present. He was gone a lot for work, but when he was home, he made sure to have quality time and make memories that still stick out to me. And, I had a mom who was involved in all of our lives. I have two sisters, and she loves us all very dearly and did a good job raising us. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that. And I love my sisters dearly, and I'm just so blessed to have the family and the childhood and the upbringing that prepared me for my life. So my childhood is a huge gift that I will always be grateful for. Um, Now, as I got older and started high school, in fact, it was actually probably a little bit before high school, where a gentleman came into our junior high class for Sunday school and shared a little bit about his story. His name was Mr. Valentin, and he ended up being one of my teachers in high school, who was a fantastic teacher. But at that time, when he was sharing his story, he talked about how he had prayed for his wife and prayed to meet his wife. And even at a very young age, that was something that was very important to him. And he was living his life in a way that would honor his wife before he even knew her. And that was so incredible to me. And I'm sorry, Mr. Valentin, I can't remember specifically. I think he said that he met his wife at 15. And so I believe I was about 12 at the time. And I just knew that's what I wanted. I wanted to know my wife and be ready for her. And, and the way I saw it in my head is I didn't want to waste time on relationships that weren't for me. I believed that there was a woman out there that God had for me, which meant all the other women were not for me. So at the age of 12, I started praying for my wife. And anytime I had a crush on a girl or was interested, I would just pray. And I say, God, is this my wife? She's really cute. I would really love to date her. And hearing the voice of God is a very strange and difficult thing for me, at least. I know plenty of people who have an easier time with that. But for me, I think just because of my personality being so unsure of myself, I had a hard time discerning the voice of God. But when it came to this, it was always pretty clear. Time after time, like, God, there's this girl I want to date. She's in this youth group, or she's at school in this grade, and I would always just hear no. So, okay, well, then I guess the answer is no. Then I'm not interested in that relationship, as disappointed as I may be at that time. And so starting high school, that was still basically my main priority. I'll say I was not an incredible student. I tested really well, but I was terribly forgetful and would not do my homework. So I would get good grades on the tests, but if the tests are 20% of my grade, then I got a 20%. So that was something that I had to continuously work at and constantly making up. I'd be going to school after school. I'd be doing summer school, almost every year of high school. Probably the one time that I had a 3.0 in high school is the year that Halo 2 came out. And so, yeah, I'm definitely a nerd, and loved video games. So my mom said, like, okay, well, if you get a 3.0 and you maintain it, when that game comes out, you can skip school and go play with your friend. And so for the first and last time, I maintained a 3.0 GPA, and Halo 2 came out, and I I skipped school. I went to the midnight release, waiting outside the mall to get into GameStop. My friend Josh, he had actually bought the limited edition and got two copies and gave one to me, and we went back home and played Halo 2, and that was a great time. And then immediately after that, I was back to getting in trouble for not doing well in school, especially even more so now because now I had proven that I could do it. It was just a matter of motivation. So I kind of showed my hand there. High school was also punctuated by moments of stubbornness. About halfway through my freshman year, I can't remember what it was, but I just recognized that I was dealing with a lot of anger and frustration. And a lot of that came from, I still had this very strong desire to find my wife. And so I would constantly be praying about these girls, and the answer was constantly no. And I just would be so angry. And there was just one day where I just decided, I don't want to be angry anymore. I don't want to be like this. And so I decided to take more control of my relationship with God and really lean into that, and started doing devotions and reading the scripture more, and taking notes even more so than I would take during class, honestly, for better or worse. And really just leaning into growing in that way, which made me very secure in my faith. So I would wear, Christian t-shirts almost on a daily basis, and almost on a daily basis, I would get picked on for it. There was a guy who would, push me up against the wall or throw me. Starting high school, I was maybe 5 feet tall, all of, 85, 90 pounds. I was easy to throw around. And so I would get picked on and say, hey, if you wear that shirt again, I'm going to beat you up. And so I would wear the shirt again because, screw you. Obviously, if I'm wearing a shirt to represent the God I love, and some dumb guy who's just a little bit bigger, well, quite a bit bigger than me, decides that he wants to hit me for it, then he can hit me for it. But I'm not going to let him dictate, how I dress or how I express my love for God. So that was something that I brought upon myself. And so high school was not easy. Certainly could have been a lot worse, and a lot of it is my own fault. But sophomore year, I started being more involved in the church, and I had been practicing guitar for 2 years so that I could finally join, the worship team in my high school ministry group. And so I had started doing that, and I was playing guitar. And I remember the night that, now my wife walked through the door. We were still doing practice, and she walked in, and that was it. I mean, love at first sight. I was awestruck. And so I immediately, began praying, like, God, please tell me this is the one. And I remember telling the leader of our team, like, hey, I wonder if she sings. And, we found out eventually that she does sing, and like, we should get her on our worship team. And he said, like, well, if you want to approach her and you want to ask her to be on the team, then you can do that. So, not a smooth kid. And I eventually, approached her, and she joined our worship team on vocals. And so we started hanging out more. All the while, I was consistently praying, just seeking God, and like, tell me, is she the one? And after a couple months, I just felt the answer. He's like, yes, this is the girl you've been waiting for. And I was super excited, but also super nervous, because at that point I'm 15, not a smart man by any means. I'm a 15-year-old kid. I've been praying for a few years, and I thought, like, what, this really could just be me getting overexcited. Maybe, my wants are being louder than God's voice. So just to be sure, I took the next 6 months and and started fasting and praying, and really, again, doubling down on the time I'm spending in the scripture to make sure that I can discern my own voice from the will of God. And so after that 6 months, the answer was still yes. And so one thing led to another, and eventually we started dating. Now, being fortunate to have found my wife so early and knowing that I was going to marry her before we even started dating, I thought the hard part was over. I had spent so much time coming to that conclusion that I thought dating should go pretty smooth, right? Because how hard could it be if you already know you're going to marry the person? Turns out, dating your wife when you're 15 is still hard. And being, at the very least, in a somewhat toxic church environment at that time, and not to say that church in general is a toxic environment, but some of the leadership that we had in our high school ministry at the time, and the way that my wife and I were treated because of our relationship was certainly unhealthy, to say the least. I had friends tell me that I had literally turned away from God to serve the devil in pursuit of some girl, even with them knowing how much time and effort I had put into this endeavor and how seriously I took it. That is how some of my friends treated me regarding it. And the same went for leadership. My wife and I had been encouraged to get into a relationship because everybody thought it would just be so cute, with me playing guitar and singing a little bit and her singing. They just thought it was a good match. But then once we actually started that, a lot of that judgment came in, and that, our church had a philosophy of no dating in high school, and there's some very legitimate reasons to think that way. But like with most things, there's no one solution or philosophy that is going to work for every single person or that is right for every single person. So if you are in a leadership position, especially, as an adult leading kids, and you've got, 200 kids that you're responsible for, if you think that you're going to reach out to, administer, and guide every single person the same way, you're going to have a hard time. And that's what happened with us. It was once we stepped outside of those guidelines of how it's supposed to look, we ran into a lot of discouragement and not a lot of guidance. And so we struggled, with it being our first relationship, certainly the first serious relationship, and being so young and trying to figure all that out, knowing our goals. That was a really difficult thing. And certainly I was an absolute fool so often, not knowing how to really communicate well or argue gracefully or be humble. So those are things that I'm learning slowly and in a very difficult way. So after struggling for a while, we, early into our relationship, we got some guidance and we got mentorship from a couple of leaders in that ministry who had been there for us and did want to see us succeed. And so we started going and meeting with, their names were Heather and Justin, and we met with them on a regular basis for some time just so they could really educate us on how to communicate. And I could not recommend that enough, especially for young people who are deciding to enter into a relationship like that. You're just not a good communicator. If you're 15 in a relationship, you're not a good communicator. It's just not going to happen. Most, if not all, adults struggle with communication. For our entire lives as human beings, it is difficult to check your ego and listen more than you speak. So having those lessons early on is something that Nicole and I are both so grateful for to this day. So I can't say enough about the value of mentorship and finding people that you love and respect and that with your whole heart want the best for you and are willing to guide you in a way that suits you and that you can hear and understand and grow from. And so that was a very valuable experience. And so we started dating early into my junior year in high school. And things just kind of went like that. We had a good relationship, I would say, but still it was hard. Wouldn't change it for anything, though. It's exactly what I had wanted. I had asked God to bring me my wife early in life, and that's exactly what happened, and it's worth every bit of effort to have that. And so as we graduated from high school and left that ministry and quote unquote went out into the real world while still living at home, so not that real yet. I was working and Nicole was working. So I had graduated in 2006, and just barely, by the way. My grades were a struggle right up to the very end, but I did in fact graduate, and had been working on college applications, and had gotten accepted. And so, graduated in June, and in November of that same year, I had proposed to Nicole, and the story of our proposal is briefly recounted in an earlier episode if you wanted to look back at that and know more about that. But we got engaged and married in May of 2007, and everything went by so quickly. I had just turned 19, and she was still a couple weeks away from turning 19, so just a couple of kids, but we knew what we were doing. We knew at least why we were doing it, and we knew it was the right choice. Now, after that engagement came the realization that I'm starting my own family. I am, moving out of my parents' house and deciding to become a husband and provider, and some of the weight that carries meant college was going to be my responsibility at that point. I'm a grown man who's, certainly old enough to take on the responsibility of a family and a household. So it was my responsibility to take care of my education as well. And I believe things are a lot different these days, but during that time, it was one of those situations where my parents made too much money for me to qualify for a lot of financial aid and scholarships. So it was going to be on me to cover the financial cost of college. And I should back up a little bit, because when Nicole and I were dating, I had mentioned to her, on multiple occasions that I wanted to join the Army after high school. Like I had said, that's something that I had always wanted since I was a very young age. And then, 9/11 happened when I was in 8th grade. And that just further cemented this burning desire to serve in the military. And watching 9/11 happen and watching the global war on terrorism start while I was still too young to participate was a hard thing. I know that's, a little off track, but just to say that, I had mentioned to her that my intention was to join the military after high school. And during that time, she had told me, well, I would never marry somebody who was in the Army. That's not a lifestyle that I want, which is a smart thing to say. So knowing that she was going to be my wife, at that point, I had just accepted, okay, well, more than anything, I want to be a husband and a good one. So if the girl that I'm going to marry has no desire to marry someone who's in the Army, then I won't join the Army. And so I didn't join the Army after high school. But then when we got married and things were so tough, I mean, not eating sometimes, and sometimes, I would get off work at 1:00 in the morning, and I would just take tips from bussing tables, and we'd go to Carl's Jr. and eat off the dollar menu. And sometimes that would be the only thing we ate. And there were also times where we just received these anonymous blessings, and we would have, cash in our mailbox that would allow us to go buy groceries. And that was an incredible blessing that we had. But financially, which is common for newlyweds, especially when you're, 18, 19 years old, we were broke, about as broke as you could possibly be. And so while we're sitting there, looking at our financial situation and trying to look into our future and see a way where it gets better, we just revisited that old idea of, there is an opportunity where I could have a good job, a steady paycheck, and it would pay for my college. And so we took some time and prayed about joining the Army, and we had decided that was the way to go. It was still a little scary, but honestly, I was a young kid. I didn't think about all of that, and how could you? You don't really know what it's like. So I went into the Army recruiting station. I had looked through a long list of jobs that were available, but I knew that I wanted to go into aviation. And I would love to go to flight school. So when I'm in the Army, I want to be doing something that is related to that field. So I went in, I watched their, promotional videos about what military occupational specialties do what, and what the options are for enlisting at that time. And so I looked at the recruiter and I said, I want a 15 Tango slot. I want to be a Black Hawk helicopter repair, work my way up to crew chief, and be prepared for flight school after my service. And the recruiter looked at me and said, well, we don't really have any available slots right now. What we're really looking for is medics, cooks, and truck drivers. I said, okay, those all sound like very interesting jobs. Please call me when you have a 15 Tango slot available. And I got up and I walked out. And about 10 minutes later, the recruiter called me back. He's like, hey man, I think we've got one for you, and called me back into the office. So they had a spot available. If you want to join as a 15 Tango and they're telling you that you can't, you can. And so we had started that paperwork, but during the process, just in case, I went to the Air Force recruiter, and they had a sign in the window that says, you can choose your job. I said, oh, okay. Well, I've heard that the Air Force has better facilities, maybe better morale, and it's just like a nicer way to go. I was like, well, if I'm wanting to be in aviation, I'll at least take a look. So I'm talking to the Air Force recruiter and said, hey, the sign in the window says you can pick your job. He says, absolutely. What do you want to do? So I told him, I want to work on Black Hawk helicopters. And he corrected me because in the Air Force, they're not called Black Hawk helicopters. I want to say they're Pave Hawks, but I can't remember. I said, okay, well, that's what I want. So, all right, write it down here. And he handed me a list. And I said, well, what are all these other spots for? It's like, oh, well, you write down the job that you want. It's like, well, I wrote down the job that I want, but there's like 7 more slots here. It's like, yes, you pick 8 jobs, you go through your training, and then the Air Force will put you into the correct job. And so, well, I don't want to be, and the suggestions on the page were, a light wheel vehicle mechanic, or a driver, or a weatherman, all these different fields that I had no interest in being. And I told him, well, I don't want to do those. I want to do this one. I said, well, it doesn't work that way. So, well, the sign says that it does. And nonetheless, I went down to MEPS and I took their test there just in case. And ultimately I decided that it really wasn't worth the risk to end up with a job that I didn't want and have this long commitment hating my job. So I told the Air Force recruiter, never mind. He got pretty upset about that, but ultimately I went back to the Army. And this is where we get into that story that I had mentioned before. With my best friend growing up, we had always said, like, hey, if we join the Army, we're going to join together. And so I call him up and I'm like, hey, I'm pretty sure I'm joining the Army soon. He said, oh, why would you do that? So I talk about it with them, and so like, hey, remember we said we'd go together. Do you want to come with me? He says, oh man, I can't do that. I'm in college now. And for better or worse, he made the right decision at the time. I absolutely believe that. But he wasn't coming with me. And so there was another couple from the high school ministry group that we had grown up with, and he actually played drums where I played guitar on the same team, and so we had both gotten married pretty close in age, and so we had been growing in our relationship that way and just really relating to each other. And so my wife and I called them up, Justin and Grace, and we asked them to go out to dinner, and we told them, like, hey, I'm joining the Army next month. And he said, that is the dumbest thing that you could possibly do. Why on earth would you join the Army? And a couple weeks later, he went down to MEPS with me, and we joined together and both got 15 Tango slots. We didn't go to the same basic training together, so that was a bummer. But November 2007, a year after getting engaged and, roughly 6 months after getting married, we shipped out. He went to Fort Sill, and I went to what was lovingly referred to as Relaxin' Jackson. But I will say that it was much more strict than what I heard from his stories at Fort Sill. It was a different experience for sure. But at that point, I left my new wife behind to go train in the Army. And I had already had multiple people tell me that, I couldn't be in the Army. I was too nice to be in the Army, which was super irritating. And for the record, I don't think you can be too nice to join the Army. If you're too nice to be a soldier, they can fix that. They can make you mean if that's what they need. I think you can really only be too mean. You can't be too nice, because if you're too mean for the Army, then you're probably just a hazard and a liability to everybody, and they're not going to fix that. But being too nice is something that, is easy to work with, I think. So I wasn't too worried about being too nice for the Army. And so we get there, and I was so nervous. I was a wreck. I remember sitting in the airport, waiting for the buses to come pick us up to take us to Fort Jackson. And my heart's racing. I'm hyperventilating. All the other people around me are like, man, you just got to calm down. It's just basic training. It'll be fine. But, I'm a small town kid, and this was so different, and growing up so fast, going from, a high school kid in a small town to now, now I'm a husband. Now I'm a man. Now I'm on my way to basic training during a time of war, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. And so I didn't handle the transition well, I would say. But we get there, and it is everything you would expect it to be. It is nonstop screaming and running and chaos and humiliation and insecurities. And typically you have, like a 4-day reception period where you get some uniforms issued, you get your haircuts, you get, your shots, and then you move on to another location, and that's when the real training starts. But for whatever reason, our reception period ended up being 10 days, not 4 days. And just in that 10 days, people got so nervous, people tried to run away. Some people got injured trying to, go AWOL. Unfortunately, one individual committed suicide just from the anxiety of starting basic training, but feeling like she had no way out. And so it was already immediately a pretty intense experience. And even in basic training, I absolutely loved and hated the Army. I had a fantastic time, but boy, was I also miserable. Hated being away from my wife. Hated not knowing what I was doing. Hated getting screamed at and not knowing why, because a lot of times it's not my fault, but if it's somebody else's fault, it's everybody's fault. So you're going to get smoked either way. And that was such a foreign concept to me. And, down the line, I understand and I appreciate and absolutely support that type of training. But it was a big adjustment, obviously. But at the same time, man, you have a lot of fun. Built relationships with people that, you see people from all walks of life. How often as a civilian are you training with all these types of weapons that, as a kid, I had always wanted to play with, as crazy as that sounds. Like, it was an opportunity that most of the population doesn't get to have, an insight in training and education and maturity and responsibility. All these things get shoved down your throat early into your life. And it felt terrible, but it also felt wonderful. And so I'm very grateful for that. And another thing that is so valuable that I experienced in basic training that is so hard to find on the civilian side is this idea of absolutely loving and trusting people, whether you like them or not. We had regular meetings. I'm a Christian, and there were trainees who, we had someone who was Jewish and Mormon and Muslim and Buddhist and atheist. And we were all in this horrible suck that is boot camp, understanding that we're all here for the same mission and we're all there for each other, understanding the gravity of the relationship that we are building. And so we took that time not to criticize each other's beliefs, but to learn from each other and honestly and respectfully come to understand other people's perspectives, which is a very hard thing to do, I've found, in other environments where people can be vulnerable and honest and still adamantly disagree with you in every aspect, but still be good friends. And so that was an incredibly valuable experience that I'm so grateful for. The Army is a fantastic place to meet people that you would never meet otherwise, and to build a relationship with them and to humble yourself and recognize that regardless of all the differences, we're just people and we're just trying to figure it out. And being able to share your faith is huge and it's important and it's beautiful, but also being able to understand people and see them in a light that isn't judgmental was a beautiful experience. Despite the great experiences and the team building and the pride and the explosions and the range days and all the fun stuff, being away from my wife, like I said, was terrible. And it was a 12-week training after that 10 days because they had added on the combat lifesaver training course to our basic training, which wasn't normal at the time. And during that 12-week period, I got 3 phone calls, 3 5-minute phone calls with my wife. One when I first got there in that first week, another one later on. The Super Bowl was going on while I was in basic training, and they actually allowed us, you can choose you can watch the Super Bowl if you want, or you can make a call home. And so the Super Bowl party had chips and Gatorade and all these things that we weren't allowed to eat ever. Or you get a 5-minute phone call. So I stood out in line, waited 2.5 hours with my calling card to use the payphone, and got to call her for 5 minutes, and then got one more towards the end of my training. So that was a really hard experience, and I still to this day have all the letters that I wrote to her and that she wrote to me, and I love that. But that was still a hard thing to go through. But I'm also grateful for that because I think that certainly plays a part in the foundation of our relationship. Now, going back about halfway through my training, I had consistently struggled with running. I'm not much of a runner, but halfway through my training, as I'm getting better and more physically fit and doing a lot better and put on 20 pounds worth of muscle during the course of basic training, I started to get really sick, and I had no idea why. I mean, every time we had to do anything, I was throwing up. I would eat and I would throw up, and then I'd run outside and we'd do push-ups, throw up, sit-ups, throw up, go for a run, throw up. And I was just in horrible pain all the time, to the point that I ended up in the hospital. I can't remember what led to that first trip to the hospital, but I was just on the ground in tears, not knowing what was wrong. And so they put me in a van, told me to put my head down because you can't see where you're going. And when we got to Atlanta, they took me to the hospital and said that they weren't sure what was wrong. But I certainly had something going on. And so they gave me some medication and gave me a medical, it's called a profile, but it's basically a medical limitation. I could not run anymore. Now, I had passed my PT test, despite how painful it was to get through all that. I had passed everything up until that point. But I got this limitation saying that I could no longer run while I'm in basic training. That doesn't go very well. As we go into the final phase of our training and things start winding down and you start formalizing and preparing for the graduation, and they do this ceremony where they're saying, now you're a soldier. One of my drill sergeants pulled me aside and said, "Hey, like, you can't be in this ceremony." I'm like, "Drill sergeant, I'm not sure what you mean." I was like, "You are not going to be a soldier. You have to stay back." He's like, "Because you have this medical limitation." And I still, pushed back, not arguing with my drill sergeant by any means, but I questioned it, saying, I've seen other trainees who have these medical profiles, and I know that they're still graduating. And I said, well, the rules are different for National Guard. They can just have to pass one PT test during that time. However, you're, active Army, you cannot graduate with a medical profile. And so they put me off into this separate group of all the people who weren't going to be graduating while they did the ceremony for the remaining real soldiers. And it just broke my heart because I had worked so hard and I was proud of myself for the work that I had done, and I'd been through a lot to get to that point. So to have this realization that I wasn't going to be moving forward was devastating. And so I confirmed with another drill sergeant and said, "Drill sergeant, didn't you say that if we were to ever lose our medical profile, then we essentially don't have one? We're responsible for that paperwork. And if we misplace it, we officially have no medical limitations at that point." And he said, "Yes, McClure, that's correct." So went back to the barracks that night, ripped up my medical limitations, and I went to my drill sergeant the next morning. I said, "Drill sergeant, I need to take a new PT test." And he said, "McClure, you have a medical profile. You can't." I told him, "I do not have a medical profile. I have no possession of that paperwork, sir." I clarify, I did not say sir. I said drill sergeant. You don't say sir to a drill sergeant. I learned that quickly. But I told him I don't have a medical profile, and so I would like to take a PT test. And so the next morning, because this is very near the end of our training, the next morning everybody else is getting a day with their family. Everybody's got their cell phones back, and it's a big deal. But I got up a couple hours earlier than everybody else. It was me and this one drill sergeant and one other soldier. And they put me through a PT test, 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning that morning. And I ran like my life depended on it. And I felt miserable and I threw up a whole lot, but I got through it. And so they gave me the new paperwork that said I was going to be graduating. And so, kind of like high school where it was really down to the wire. I mean, down to the less than a week before graduation for basic training, I didn't know if I was going to make it or not. So I just told myself, like, whatever's going on with me, I'll figure it out when I get to my duty station, but I'm going to be a soldier. So I graduated basic training and moved on to my job training in Fort Eustis, Virginia. And almost immediately having very similar experiences when it comes to the pain. Now, I had a great time in my job training out there in Virginia. In fact, my wife and Justin's wife, Grace, they actually moved out and got an apartment in Williamsburg. So then during your AIT, your job training, you can actually leave post on the weekends, and depending on your PT scores, you can leave all weekend. Now, because of the illness and the symptoms I was having, I was struggling so much that I was lucky to pass my PT test. I was not excelling by any means, so I was not getting to go off post a whole lot. But we still had some great memories being together. We had a couple weekends where I did get to go off post, and we went to amusement parks and spent time together, and it was fantastic. But I was still very sick. And I remember sneaking out of PT one time and just going back into the barracks and going straight into the bathroom. And one of the drill sergeants comes into the bathroom, is a female drill sergeant body, I want to say. And she starts banging on the door. She says, "McClure, if you're in here, you better need to go to the hospital." I said, "Yes, Sergeant, I think I need to go to the hospital. And I'll spare you the details, but I definitely needed medical attention." And so she, "Oh, shoot, okay, sit tight, we'll get you a van." And so I end up going to the hospital again, and it's kind of the same deal, going through colonoscopies and medical profiles, and essentially through the course of that, still not having a diagnosis, still not knowing what's going on, still sucking at PT and throwing up after every single exercise. But just like in basic training, I just told myself, I'm going to get through this. I'll figure it out when I get to my duty station, but I'm not giving up. And so I spent a lot of time in remedial PT, doing extra PT and extra runs to make up for it, to the point that I could pass all of those tests. And then we have our graduation ceremony in July of 2008. And right before I leave the base, one of the drill sergeants finds me. And he says, "Don't you have a medical profile?" Well, I said, "Well, no, Sergeant. I passed my PT test. I did the run even with that limitation." And he was of the mind that I should stay there until I have a diagnosis and either get kicked out or just recycled, but he did not want to see me go. So literally ran from him while he goes to talk to Top, first sergeant. I had known the commander at that point, so I could have talked to him, and I don't recommend this way of doing things, honestly. However, I was very much set on getting to my duty station and not getting out because of some medical condition that I didn't even know what was going on at that point. And so I got the commander's okay to leave. So while the drill sergeant's off looking for someone else, we hop in the car and we take off. And so I had officially made it through my training, came back to California for 2 weeks of recruiting duty, which was a good time, and then off to Germany. We had a class of 315 Tango helicopter repairmen in our training class. 150 went to Germany, and 150 went to 160th. And I would have been happy either way. I was certainly concerned about going into 160th with some of the medical issues that I was having, but Germany was on my wish list anyway, so I was happy to have it. And so, unfortunately, they hadn't finished the paperwork to allow my wife to come with me. So she stayed in California, and I went to Germany. And so I get to the airport in Frankfurt after a miserable time traveling, and I'm watching all the buses of soldiers get picked up and go to their bases, and I'm sitting there all day until finally, I believe it was the staff sergeant who walks up to me. He's questioning me, "Well, why aren't you getting on the bus?" I show him my orders, and I still had orders to a base that had closed 6 months ago, and my orders just didn't get updated, so nobody was coming to pick me up. So he said, "All right, well, you can get on this bus." And thank goodness that it was the bus that Justin, was going on too. So we ended up in different battalions, but at least we were on the same base. And it was a small base anyway, so we lived very close. And I really enjoyed Germany. It was difficult, and there were a lot of struggles with that. And now it still took a good 3 months for the Army to get the paperwork together to allow my wife to come overseas with me. So during that time, I'm spending hundreds and hundreds of dollars on these payphone calls back to California to talk to my wife. And like I said, before I shipped out to Germany, I had 2 weeks to spend time with my wife. And so now I'm in Germany. I've been there for a while, and I'm on the phone, and my wife tells me that she's pregnant. And I remember being excited, but also just absolutely terrified, not knowing what that means. I'm 20 years old. I'm the unit was currently deployed, but we're already making preparations and talking about what that next deployment is going to look like. And our plan was to not have kids until we got out of the Army. And it just didn't work that way. We all went home for 2 weeks, and all of our wives got pregnant. And so during that time, I made good friends with Ben, who's on the last couple podcast episodes. Ben was in Virginia with us, and we trained together, and he was also in the same battalion as Justin. And Justin, we should definitely do a podcast episode together sometime if you're watching this, and I would love that. Anyways, so all of our wives are pregnant in Germany at a very young age, and it was just a bizarre experience for me. I can't even imagine how literally foreign that is, and emotionally what my wife is going through at that point, being pregnant with her first child at such a young age on the other side of the world from her entire family, knowing that I'm making preparations to go to a war zone, while still dealing with my own medical issues, and still at that point not knowing what was going on. And with that, it eventually reached a point where I had lost, that at that point, 30 pounds that I had gained through military training up to that point, I had lost it all. I had lost so much weight, and I was so sick that I had actually passed out during PT, and still not having a diagnosis. They just decided, okay, well, you can't do PT anymore until we figure this out. So through terrible, humiliating, drawn out processes, I ended up getting diagnosed with Crohn's disease and had no idea what that was or what that meant. I just knew that I was always in pain. I couldn't eat anything. I couldn't put on weight. I couldn't work out. Had no idea how I was going to ever deploy with this condition. And so they offered me some medications. So, okay, we'll take these 10 pills every day for the next month and see what happens. And I truly thought I was dying. I was so miserable. I didn't know how I was going to survive. And so I'd tell the doctors, like, it's not working. I was like, okay, well, let's try 20 pills. And so I take 20 pills a day for the next, 2 or 3 months, trying to figure it all out, and still not even under control, just zero improvement. So it got up to just over 30 pills a day that I'm taking, feeling miserable, dealing with all the side effects that comes with taking 30 pills a day of, I don't even know what, because, I'm at that point, 21-year-old kid in the Army. I'm just taking whatever they tell me to take, no questions asked, which is a terrible idea. But even over 30 pills a day, still no improvement. And so I go back to the doctor, and it was a major, and she said, well, 32 pills hasn't worked, but we can try 35. And I just shake my head. I was so worn out at that point. She said, or what happens in the civilian world, as soon as you get this diagnosis, they just start you on this infusion, and that typically works. I said, well, shoot, like if 32 pills a day isn't working, the odds of 35 working are pretty slim. Like, let's do the infusion. And we start the infusion process, fill out all the paperwork. I still have no idea what I'm doing at that point. But I start this infusion, and I said, great, I hope this works. And so I come back the next week, and I'm already feeling better, and we do another infusion, and it's starting to really work. I said, okay, this is fantastic. I need you to sign this paperwork. I have to take this to my commander because we're deploying to Afghanistan at this time frame. And so I need him to know that I'm good to go now. And the major just looked at me and was like, you're not going? I was like, well, yeah, I'm definitely going. That's kind of my job. Like, we're going to Afghanistan. There's no way around this. She says, no, you can't go. Where I was going in Afghanistan, there was no medical services available. She said, you cannot take this medication. It can't make the transportation there because once you mix it, it's only good for 6 hours, or I can't remember if it was 6 exactly, but it's only good for a short amount of time once you make it in the pharmacy. And they don't have the infrastructure to make it there. I said, okay, well, how often do I have to get the infusion? She said, well, every 2 months. It's like, okay, well, it's a 12 to 15 month deployment. I go to the commander. I say, sir, like, I'm good to go. This medication works fantastic. The only thing is you have to provide transportation from this dirt field in Kandahar back to Launchstool Regional Medical Center every 2 months so I can get my infusions, and then I'm right back out. And of course, he thought I was joking. It's like, of course we're not going to do it. Like, sir, like, this is what I need to be able to go. So, well, then you're not going. And I think my family was obviously happy to see that medically and physically I had leveled out a little bit and was safe. And on top of that, the news of not deploying was incredible news to my entire family, and justifiably so. But for me, as a soldier who had worked so hard and sacrificed a lot to get to that point and been through so much and loved being a soldier and loved the men and women that I was serving with, the thought of not going broke my heart. And I thought about it a lot, and I couldn't get over it. And I just kept thinking, how is this okay? I mean, because I knew the people that I worked with, and I loved them, but I also knew that they just weren't ready. Like, not that they weren't ready to do their job. I worked with great people, but I had never been on a deployment, but I know what some of the risks are, and I'm still very secure in my faith. And I know that if something terrible were to happen while I was deployed, at least I know where I'm going when I die. And I had people that I loved, that I worked with, that did not have that same assurance. And so the thought of one of them taking my place, it was really hard to deal with. And I didn't take it well. I think it made me a bad husband during that time. And not to say that I'm not responsible for that. I was just so confused and so angry that I spent so much time just inward and dealing with that and not focusing on, my incredibly patient, beautiful wife and such a terrible, confusing, and difficult position that she was in, and our new baby. I wasn't taking all of the change very well. And so I struggled quite a bit. And like I had mentioned in the last episode with Ben, I went and got some mental health counseling, and that certainly did not go well. But the idea of not deploying was awful. And so I had to tell the guys that I worked with, like, hey, like, you guys are going without me. And how do you explain that to somebody? Because, they could see that I wasn't at PT with them, that I had to sneak into the gym to the point that I got kicked out of the gym. So I'm just working out at home, just trying to stay fit because that's my job. Um, but they didn't see how sick I was really. They just saw that I was skinny. Um, so when I told them, like, oh, well, I can't go. I have Crohn's disease. Like, well, what the hell is Crohn's disease? Like, they just thought I was scared and didn't want to go on my deployment, so I was making stuff up. And I'm sure that that has happened, but for me, that wasn't the case. But I lost a lot of relationships there because everybody's getting ready for deployment, and that's going to build a bond. So when they think that I'm trying to get out of a deployment because I don't want to be a part of the group, I don't want to do my job, and I don't want to take that risk with them, um, I kind of lost my place in the family there. And so that was hard to deal with. But I did have an incredible commander. When I first got to Germany, she was Lieutenant Burns. But at this time, she had been promoted and got married to Captain Young. And Captain Young, you were an incredible leader. And I am so grateful for that. But she had taken me aside and said, like, you're non-deployable, and that may be the case forever, but you're a good soldier. So they're talking about medboarding you out. You're going to get out of the Army. But if you want to stay in, we'll figure something out. You'll be non-deployable. Maybe you'll be non-deployable for 6 whole years. We have no idea. But she said that she would fight tooth and nail to get me to stay in if that's what I wanted. And selfishly, that's what I wanted, because I had immersed my entire identity in this thought of being a soldier, and being a good soldier was all that mattered. Now, that's not true. I absolutely should be a good human being, a good husband, a good father, and I wasn't doing all of those well, so I just picked one. And I wasn't doing great at that one either at that point because I was so sick, so it was not a clear winner. And now, because of the rank and the authority difference, we didn't have a lot of personal conversations, but I did know that we shared the same faith. So at that point, I didn't really have a whole lot to lose. So I just explained to her, ma'am, I want to stay, but I need to take some time and I've got to pray about it. So just give me a week. So I took a week and just poured my heart out to God. Like, please, God, like, just tell me what to do. I gotta know, because none of it made sense and none of it felt right. It didn't feel like there was a right choice or a good choice. So I just needed a push. And I can't say that I felt an audible or heard an audible voice saying, like, Cole, this is what I want you to do. But by the end of the week, I knew that I needed to get out. And it was absolutely the right choice, but it was terrible. I thought, well, me doing the right thing looks like when I get out, things are going to go well because I'm doing the right thing. Like, that's how things are supposed to work. And so I start going to these transition courses to prepare myself for civilian life again. And so when you're doing these courses and they help you build a resume, they ask you, what do you want? What's going on? So I told them, like, well, I've got Crohn's disease. I've been in for less than 3 years and I want to be a helicopter pilot. And they just looked at me and said, like, well, there's really nothing we can do for you. And so they signed my paperwork and let me go. And so, a lot of medical appointments and terrible things and good things that all happened during that time. And so I'm skipping over a lot, I feel like, but I could talk for hours about this experience. So the point is, I got out of the Army and it didn't go well again. I made the right choice, and then it was so hard, I immediately just began to blame God. Uh, if I'm doing the right thing, why isn't this working? Why don't I have a job? Why am I not feeling better? Why am I not getting along with my family? And why am I having these fights and these struggles? Why do I feel this way? And I felt so lost. And getting out of the army and not having a place to go to, I was still stuck in that mode of being a soldier, just waiting for the army to call me back, like, hey, never mind, we need you. And so I didn't move on. I hated myself for not being deployable, for being home when my friends were in Iraq and Afghanistan, for doing nothing with my life, just being unemployed, no skills, no college, no friends. And with how fast everything had happened, from the point of graduating high school to getting married, joining the army, having a kid, and then coming back to the States and having nowhere to go except back into my parents' home. Well, they didn't have time either to really process that transition. So to them, I'm still a kid. And so that caused so much strife there that it made me question whether God cared at all. Why on earth would he tell me to get out knowing how horrible things were going to be? And in the weeks leading up to getting out of the army, I'd started to rebuild friendships with Josh, who I had mentioned, during my high school years, who we were super close, third grade through eighth grade, and still close in high school, but then kind of had a falling out. And so we hadn't talked in a while, but leading up to getting out of the army, we had started to rebuild that friendship, and I was really looking forward to spending time with him once I got out. And so I got out in March of 2010, but things were so chaotic and I was so miserable that I wasn't reaching out to anybody. And so I was just kind of wallowing for a few months, trying to figure stuff out. I got jobs where I could, but none of them stuck. I was still so sick. And then I got in a fight with my parents, just really, I don't know what it was about. It was just everything. And so my wife and I, we left and came back in the evening because, like I said, we were living there at the time. And June 10th, 2010, we came home late at night and everybody's crying. And so I'm asking what's going on. And Josh had committed suicide. And so I had dealt with some suicides that had happened in Germany, and suicide in the military was and is a terrible, terrible problem. And so we had done all this training on suicide prevention and recognizing the signs and responses, and I had been to 3 funerals for soldiers who had committed suicide just while I was in Germany. And so when I got the news about Josh, it didn't hit me right away. I just kind of went into that response mode and started making phone calls and notifications of people who, I had grown up with, who I thought needed that information, and took the next probably 18 hours to make sure that I was making those phone calls and just in a different headspace. And then the next night, I just broke down because it finally hit me how real that was. And I loved Josh very much, and he was a good man who struggled with his own mental health issues. But it certainly highlighted where I was at for me. Because I had certainly had some pretty dark days after leaving the army. But seeing what had happened there, just I couldn't do that. It wasn't an option. I could never put my family through that. even if I felt like I didn't have a purpose or that I wasn't useful to anybody at that point in my life. I felt like I was failing as a husband, failing as a father, failing as a friend. I had already failed as a soldier and had no direction. But I knew that wasn't where I was going. So I had to start figuring some things out. And so during this process, I took more control of my life and my diet and worked with the VA and got my medication squared away again and started feeling better and wanted to go to flight school and started working towards that. And I had gone to a couple appointments at that time, going to different flight surgeons and getting rejected because of the Crohn's disease. And finally it came to the point where I had to write a letter to the head FAA doctor in Washington, D.C. with notes from a mental health provider who I had been going to, explaining how the stress of being a pilot isn't going to make my condition worse, but will actually make it better, because that's what I want to do with my life. It is not a stressor, it's a fulfillment, and would improve my health, in my opinion, and in his opinion. And getting letters from VA primary care doctors, which is almost impossible to do at that time because I couldn't keep a primary care doctor, and getting colonoscopy reports and letters from my specialty doctors. And it took almost 2 years to get this culmination of having all of this paperwork to send off to Washington, D.C., but finally got approved on a special circumstance to get a Class 2 medical certificate to get enrolled into flight school. All right, well, I guess that shrink from the VA was right. I am pretty long-winded. I was not expecting this to take so long, so I think we're going to have to break this up into a two-parter. But as promised, we'll go over the winners for the hats from YouTube. This was just selected at random. Amber Morris. My sister actually won from the YouTube subscriber section. And then from Patreon members, it was Danny Jones. So if you guys want to reach out to me on the platform of your choosing, let me know what color and what size you'd like to get, and we'll get those shipped out to you. So everybody who joined the Patreon and started subscribing on YouTube, I really appreciate it. I've seen a lot of growth in the last couple weeks since we started advertising this giveaway. So like I said, Amber and Danny, reach out to me so we'll get those hats to you. And I guess we'll wrap this up and we'll go through the remainder of the story on the next episode. So we'll start off with the effort to get into flight school and go from there. We still got a lot to cover. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let me know what you guys think about the episode. I really appreciate it. I was super nervous about telling my story. I didn't think it was going to take this long, and still I feel like I skipped over a lot of things, but maybe those will just come up in the future. And so we'll do this one here, and then the next one we'll wrap things up. So thanks again so much for tuning in, guys. Take care.